Hello, everyone. Hi, thank you for joining us so late. I hope you had all a nice day at the conference in the flesh after so many times locking in our house. I'm so happy that I'm finally here in person. So I wanted to introduce what we are going to talk about today. So we are talking about the healthcare price of longevity. This is a topic that is very dear to me. I've been very lucky to have two wonderful grandparents. My grandmother is still with us. I'm 37, so I've been enjoying her for a long time. And my granddad as well. He only passed away in 2021. And he had a pacemaker for 21 years. And he actually had this pacemaker changed 3 times. And he had an amazing care from the system in Italy. I'm Italian. He was, diabetic, he has heart condition, and if it wasn't for all the access of drugs that he could have, I'm sure I wouldn't have enjoyed it for as long as I did. So I think this is an important topic because, of course, we all have parents, we all have grandparents, and we are all ultimately getting old, but that's the hope, at least. And as we get old, we also need to start thinking about, all the different things that we are encountering in life and all the comorbidities that come with it. And then, what's old? My dad was very offended when he was offered the herpes zoster vaccine because he realized that he was then considered an elder person. He was 65, and he was like, okay, so then now I'm officially old. But it's actually a very good thing because, you take care of the people who said, look, Dad, you're lucky. You are healthy, and you are already being offered this. So the system is working. That's what I'm trying to say. But there are definitely things that we can still do to improve. So I'll pass it on to my colleague Alberto that will set the scene with a few slides, and then we go to our panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Raquel. So indeed, the system is working because we are bringing so much innovation with novel therapies, with improved healthcare, really, that has been able to really extend life. So we have seen a significant increase worldwide on life expectancy. And this has gone from one of the main issues that we had 50 years ago, which is that the main cause of mortality really across the world, it was infectious diseases. And with vaccines, we were able to really bring these under control. And now with even more of these advanced therapies coming into play, some of them which are now curative, we're really been pushing life expectancy beyond what many of us probably were thinking before. And just over the last 100 years, life expectancy has increased over 30 years across the world. So overall, medicines and healthcare is working for sure. Now, of course, if we look at this from the government perspective, so we need to pay for all of this healthcare that we're providing for sure. And of course, life expectancy is increasing, but also healthcare expenditure. And you can see here, this is an example of the healthcare expenditure in the EU over the last 20 years. And you can see that it has increased dramatically across the EU. Now, something very interesting is that correlation doesn't mean causation. And I think we learned this from COVID. Just to give you this example of this very complex analysis that was done by someone on Twitter. In the blue line, you can see the COVID cases in the US. And on the red line, you can see the bad reviews of Yankee candles on Amazon saying that they don't have any scent. So, of course, here it just shows that people were losing their sense of smell, but they didn't know they had COVID. So what I'm trying to say is we need to understand that correlation doesn't mean causation. And just because life expectancy is increasing, and we see the graph of healthcare expenditure increasing as well, it doesn't mean that just living longer is causing an increase in healthcare expenditure. So what is it then? It's everything that comes along with living longer. As we live longer, we are pretty much extending the time in life in which we get sick. So now what you can see here is that health expenditure actually correlates with aging. So as we get older, pretty much we spend more in our health. You can see here in this graph from the health expenditure in the UK between 2020 and 2021. And of course, something that is very interesting is that most of this cost is just on hospital and community healthcare services, which it's obvious because, of course, we go more often to the hospital, we require nurses, we require assistance from just carers. So overall, when you compound these with drugs, with other expenses to really care for the elderly, this is what is driving really the expenditure in healthcare. Now, like I say, it is not about just living longer. It's about how many years we are actually living not healthy. And you can see here actually some data from Eurostat showing that the proportion of years that we live in poor health significantly increases as we get older, of course. I think it's pretty obvious. So this is what is driving health expenditure in the elderly. The time or the number of years that we spend not being healthy. And as we get older and as we live longer, this expands, creating a bigger gap in where we spend more money. Now, the biggest issue is that we're living longer, but we're not necessarily living longer and living healthier. But actually, the rate of comorbidities and the rate of sickness and the rate of this time that we live or spend life in poor health is also increasing. So there's this big disconnect, and this is really what's driving the expenditure in healthcare. And of course, the diseases in the elderly continue to increase. This is just an example on the expectation on the increase of number of people with dementia worldwide, significantly increasing over the next 50 years. So we are having more and more people living longer, but also living with more complications, more comorbidities, which is what's driving healthcare. Now, luckily, we have a lot of innovation going on in the background, trying to address many of these diseases. The biggest example actually occurred just last year, when we got the first drug that addresses one of the roots of Alzheimer's disease approved in the US with Aduhelm. But very interestingly, and probably a bit unexpectedly, this didn't have the effect that probably many of us were expecting. But it had the opposite effect, that it caused almost panic among payers. How are we going to pay for this? And the first thing that happened is that, of course, healthcare expenditure went up, already thinking that we're going to have to cover for these drugs, so we need to increase the cost of Medicare. And this happened in the US, and of course, it was attributed to the cost of this novel drug for Alzheimer's disease. So how do we balance all of these? How do we balance this innovation? How do we balance that we need to treat patients longer, but also that we have more expensive drugs coming? So what needs to be done? So the objective of today is to come out with a solution for this. So I thought that we will not leave the room until we come out with a solution, and then I was told that we have drinks in 20 minutes. So instead, if we can just brainstorm, we can come out of this room with ideas that then we can follow up in the drinks and maybe tomorrow, just to get us started on what we can be doing now to address these challenges. Something that we did a little bit of homework before this is that we spoke to different stakeholders from the payers as well as from the manufacturers to see what they thought, where some of the challenges and some of the things that we could be doing now to address these before it gets out of control. And just to give you an idea, the first question is very basic. What are the top 3 healthcare challenges that we're facing when we think about healthcare for the elderly population? And here you can see just some of the most common answers among different stakeholders. And some of them are actually quite obvious, if not all of them. It's something that we will expect. But this is where we would like to open to our panel to really discuss. Are these really the top 3 challenges? Is there anything missing here? And if these are really the top challenges with this issue, how can we address them? So with that, I would like to open it to panel, but most importantly, open it to all of you to just give us your thoughts on these issues. And like I say, the idea is to brainstorm. We're not going to come out from this room with a solution, but hopefully with ideas that maybe will trigger a solution sometime soon. So I'll open it to our panel, and maybe, please, if you can introduce yourself, and please, any thoughts that you have on this question.
Alberto and Rachele, thank you very much for setting the scene. What we would like to now understand is what are the challenges and some questions. So my name is Rafat Rahmani. I'm the owner and founder of Lifescience Dynamics. I'm based out of the London office, and you are?
Good evening. My name is Igor Rudichev. I'm Vice President of Enterprise Analytics with Horizon Therapeutics. And thank you so much for having me here. And really glad to see that so many people stayed so late after the main conference. Thank you.
You are?
Good evening. Patrick Peristeri, Director International Forecasting and Analytics, also with Horizon Therapeutics, based in Switzerland.
Very good. So thank you very much for that. So the first question that Alberto posed, what are the top 3 healthcare priorities going forward? What would you say, Igor?
Yes, and that's a great question. Let me even step back for a second. In one of the early sessions on the rare diseases, the speaker gave an amazing example and picture of the bridge that was built between 2 buildings to link them. And the bridge was 1 meter short. Maybe buildings moved, maybe bridge shrink, but it was short. And that's what I think it's happening right now, that we're building the healthcare for the elderly population, which is 1 meter short. We're always trying to find the optimized healthcare, find the treatments for the past, not for the future. We are not investing much in the diagnostics. And if we do, it's diagnostics for the maybe early population. And because everything's changing right now. To me, I think the number 1 biggest problem is definitely we have to look into the future to build a strong healthcare for the elderly.
No, thank you. Patrick?
I think one additional element also, it is literally a shifting paradigm based on what was mentioned, the increased life expectancy. And it's important to keep ahead of the curve and to try to understand now what will be in the medium to long term the conditions, situations that we will be facing. There are 3, for instance, Alzheimer, which is a very important topic now, was considerably less decades ago when life expectancy was considerably shorter. So it's really about understanding how things move and keeping ahead of the curve as much as possible.
No, thank you very much. From audience, lady in the green, please. Any question from there? What would you say what are the top 3 healthcare challenges going forward? You have a question, Mike? While the mic is coming, what I want to say that are our healthcare systems set up for consumption? All the incentive program is when the patient comes to the hospital when he or she is already too ill. Is there a model to look at to focus more on prevention and have more, which is like what Igor said, our early diagnosis, and again with the innovation. So the incentive, does that need changing to bring the cost down?
Yes, exactly. And I know in some healthcare systems, like in the US, we are trying to implement those incentives to bring costs down, making sure that we can diagnose early, we can build for example, Johns Hopkins is doing amazing programs for the elderly, especially in oncology. MD Anderson is doing also great things. And even the data that we see in the lung cancer, more and more lung cancer is diagnosed on the stage 3, while in the past it used to be mostly metastatic stage 4. Now even with ALK-positive lung cancer, with EGFR mutations, with the CRAS, with the ROS mutations, I think we're getting there, but it takes time.
Thank you. Lady in the green, please.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for the
Could you
great...
state your name, please, and the company.
Okay, my name is Olga. I work for Regeneron. So thank you for a great topic and a great presentation. I think for me, we need to fundamentally, when it comes to elderly, we need to fundamentally change the way we approach development and also understanding the unmet needs of the elderly, right? Because today we obviously work a lot on indications. And although all these indications might be also, or are for elderly, I think that they are more around comorbidities, right? And if we think about, if we think about the way we develop trials, right? We include elderly if this is about their indication, but we don't think about all other comorbidities. And this is where I think we need to take care. We have companies that started to focus, for example, on women's health, right? Maybe in the future, we're gonna see companies focusing also more on elderly population. And the key question for me here is, what is the ultimate goal? Right? Do certain treatments make sense at a certain point of the life? Because I did see, like you were talking about your grandparents, but I did see many examples where certain more aggressive treatments, right, oncology, might have made sense for younger population, but actually didn't at the end for elderly. I think this is important from my point of view.
No, thank you very much.
No, this is a very good point. And I personally, for example, I disagree with one of the questions that, the answer that we received to this question, that there is a lack of focus on the elderly. I don't think that there is necessarily a lack of focus, but I think it's more like we really need to look at prevention, and we really need, as Olga was saying, to give the right therapy to the right people. You know, like if you treat someone at 97 for cancer, are probably making the rest of these few days just worse. So absolutely. But yeah, I disagree with that. However, I think the point on comorbidities is still a very valid point. And I wanted to ask also the audience and our panelists what they think, because one thing that I see a huge cost for the healthcare is when people start having like several comorbidities is, you know, the constant check of the diagnosis, the adjustment of the therapies that triggers, you know, a lot of visits, a lot of things. So that also is a huge cost. So I don't know, what do you think about it? Do you think that there is something that can be done to help reduce, you know, the number of hospital visits, etc.?
And here I would even take an example of the COVID. What was happening in the beginning? We didn't test enough. And when the testing was more used, it was more sufficient. We were able to diagnose the problem earlier. And I still remember that conversation with one of the key opinion leaders in the breast cancer. He said, there are 3 simple rules to treat breast cancer, is to test, and to test. And that's what I think we need to do. We need to test as much as we can, not only the viral conditions like COVID, but other conditions that especially impact elderly population.
Now the challenge comes with that is who's going to pay for those testing? And whether it's the pharma company, whether it's the insurance companies, and in Europe, whether it's the National Health Services, whether the National Health Service, who has the interest? Because the whole healthcare system is not that much focused what happens in the future in terms of prevention and the cost outcomes in the future. They're very much focused today. So that needs a huge mind shift. But I agree with you, Igor, that if we can change the thinking from curative and therapeutics to prophylaxis and prevention, then we are going to be ahead. Patrick, you have to say something?
Yes, I mean, I agree with you, and it's not a word that I want to use now, but I think in the end, it's about strategic thinking of healthcare and strategic thinking over one person's life. I think that is going to be one key element in the future, again, linked to the aging of the population. Elderly people, future elderly people, needs to be thought of from a healthcare perspective from the very beginning. Healthcare management is going to be a very long process. We are benefiting from advances in technologies, advances in medical support, which needs to be used from the very beginning and from an early age. I mean, it's fundamentally prevention. It's nothing else than that. But we can do it increasingly in a way that can benefit, with exceptions obviously, but from a very early stage up until a very, very late stage. And that late stage is going to be later and later, so this needs to be done from as early as possible. I think that's going to be the...
No, thanks. Yeah, go ahead.
And if we wanted to change that dynamic, who should trigger that change? Should it come from the manufacturers? Should it come from the payers? I think the patients are pushing, but of course, they are not the final decision makers. So where should this trigger come from?
Cynically, this is going to come from a crisis. That's the sad thing. Ideally, it should be an effort from every stakeholder involved, clearly. Now, who will actually do it is a very, very difficult. Whenever you think in the long term, the problem becomes who is actually willing to move and to sacrifice some short term, because this is part of the deal, unfortunately. It's difficult to answer.
And just to add to that, it's again going back to my example of the COVID. How we were able in such a short time to run so many clinical trials, to get so many great vaccines, great medications, great tests. Now you can actually, at least in the States, you can go to any Walgreens or CVS pharmacy, and your insurance actually covers multiple tests you can get. Now when it comes to the diabetes, when it comes to the oncology, it's the same, very similar situation that we as society, we need to invest in the creating of those types of tests and encouraging investors, encouraging VCs, because there are other dimensions that help to develop those early startups that create great breakthroughs in the testing, in the treatments.
And I think this morning in the very first session, what we heard is that what COVID showed is that willingness is a key driver here. And also, as you just say, the collaboration between both payers, regulatory bodies, and the manufacturers to work together. So my question was a bit redundant because we had the answer earlier. It has to be all together.
In a crisis, unfortunately.
Yeah. And it was in response to a crisis. So if we were trying to be more practical, one of the questions that we had is, what can manufacturers do to address these challenges? So one of the things that, of course, someone say is make drugs elderly friendly. And I think this is something that someone also in this morning mentioned. Since the conception of your drug, since you start developing it, already consider what's more convenient for your patient population. Now, this may go a bit further because, of course, maybe a drug is not conceived to be for the elderly from the beginning. But then how do we feed that? That maybe from the beginning, do we start to think about this drug is going to work for the elderly in the same way that we already start thinking about a pediatric population? And then something else is having specific trials in the elderly population. So how do we adapt the current practice to the elderly population? We know that the biggest challenge is comorbidities, frailty. So how do we adapt all of that?
And here, if I may, I would even kind of go outside of the just drug, just molecule, because more and more manufacturers, they have companion diagnostics. And they're also moving into the digital solutions. And I know it's been controversial. Some CEOs who used to support digital at some point, they mentioned that it's not very successful, but I think we are getting there. So it's a combination of the product, of the molecule, of drug, of the diagnostics and digital. And to answer your question also on the different types of populations, it's about how you design your clinical trials. I really personally a huge fan of the umbrella types of clinical trials and also synthetic clinical trials based on the real world data. And with synthetic clinical trials, you can actually see in the control arm or even sometimes in the test arm if the impact can be significant for the elderly population.
And now, just to cause controversy, is the fact that most of the times we design trials to be as clean as possible, because you want clean data that clearly tells you what you need to know. So what do? We put exclusion criteria, so no comorbidities, very limited age. So how can we maybe change our minds or start pushing to, and I don't want to say relax those, because of course the idea of a clinical trial is to be controlled, but maybe to be more inclusive. And this is actually one question that we had, like what are the challenges in clinical trial design and data generation? So what can we do as the manufacturers that is applicable? And of course we have ideal, but something that is applicable.
But before the clinical trial design can be changed, the regulators have to buy into the clinical trial. The manufacturer themselves cannot change a clinical trial if the data is not going to be accepted.
Yes, exactly. And here, sorry for I need to actually mention a quick disclaimer that I was supposed to say in the beginning, that all the views and opinions here are of the individuals, but not of our employees. And my personal belief there is that it's both ways. And I really believe in the synthetic clinical trials, in the real-world data. And I think the more and more we can do with the real-world data, and actually on Thursday I'm talking about going from the real-world data into the real-time data. And real-time data is really something that's even stronger than clinical trial, can really identify and treat problem on the spot. And I think it's future.
And actually, this morning we heard about how technology is enabling now monitoring, real-time monitoring. How feasible is that for the elderly? Like, can we bring all the same technology that is being used now to the elderly population? We know, of course, the challenges that may face. So, what's the feasibility of that?
But if you look at all the research that the tech companies coming with the wearable digital technology for monitoring the blood pressure, the heart rate, and also the blood sugar level, etc., and it is just going to increase more and more and more and more. So this, what you're saying about real time, is the genie is out of the bottle. It will happen.
No, I wanted to say to add on that you mentioned trials need to be clean. As technology advances, as it progresses, as data treatment becomes stronger and stronger, maybe this will allow to counterbalance to get less clean trials, including, for instance, comorbidities, elements like that, but with the technology know-how that will allow to filter through and to really understand the outcomes in a much wider scope than with clean cut.
No, very good.
And I was wondering if anyone...
any comment from the audience here? Yeah. Chris, we have a question here, please.
Yeah, and it looks like we also need another technology here, the flying mics, that the mics can go around the audience.
On a drone.
I think this is a really interesting debate, and I like how you are approaching the discussion on how to go beyond the drug and avoid hospitalizations. And I'm not sure about other countries, but I know in Portugal, for example, there's been a big debate on whether we can use the pharmacy network. We have over 3,000 pharmacies in the country. Can we use the proximity of the pharmacies to actually work on prevention, reduce the number of hospitalizations so that people don't have to go to the hospital in the end? And with that support, reduce the overall costs for the system. Now, a problem is that the pharmacies don't really have time to do this on their own, and the payer doesn't have the money to pay the pharmacies to do these pharmacy support services. So is there a room for the manufacturer to step in and actually perhaps implement some sort of support that is compliant, that the payer sees value on? What's your perspective on this?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question, because definitely pharmacy is the very important dimension in this consideration. And it also varies by country. For example, in Japan, the pharmacists are physicians, In Turkey, the pharmacists, let's say, also give recommendations on the prescriptions. In the US, pharmacists are completely separated from the treatment in some sense, which I think it's, again, we need to think about the future. And pharmacist involvement, the policy is going towards pharmacists, and the importance of the pharmacist, like in the UK, for example, I was, like, first time years ago when I heard about OTC, or actually under the counter, right, like UTC or something. Yeah, it's again, it's very interesting development, and I think the more involvement from the pharmacist standpoint, from pharmacists, as part of the treatment journey, treatment paradigm, that it's better for the patient, definitely.
One other point that I wanted to make on digital technology, like we have been discussing it in the sense of collecting data, which is great, but I think digital technology now have also space in managing symptoms. For example, there are apps to keep on measuring your visual acuity that are like little games that you can use and you see like whether you're getting worse or not. So do you think that there is a space also for, let's say, the 65 plus people also to use this type of technology, or do you think that, you know, the advanced age might prevent the use of technology in that sense to manage your symptom more than collection of data?
Maybe before I pass it to my colleagues, I'll just, years ago, I saw an amazing picture from Korean magazine on healthcare. It's about, I think, 1 or 2 year old, very nice lady, actually texting faster than 17-year-old on her Samsung. That was amazing. I think technology is coming there.
No, thank you very much. I think I want to bring us back to the focus that who's going to bear the healthcare cost of elderly and what we can be done. And just here, I'm going to throw a provocative answer, a question, and let's see answer. The generation, the baby boomers, or the generation now, is one of the richest of the retirees, because over the last 20, 30 years, the pension fund and all that has done very, very well. And many are sitting on, the house prices have gone up in most of the countries. Do you think that those people who are rich enough to afford their own health care, should they be footing the bill for their own care?
I think you are asking a very explosive political question. And I think that looking at the weight of over 60s in voting patterns, at least in Europe, I am afraid in many ways this is a no-go.
Anybody from the audience disagree about the wealthy retirees bearing their own costs? Because, okay, right.
Everyone is willing to pay their own bill.
Here we have one more.
And now we're putting on the spot almost the manufacturers. You know, what can you do? So how are you going to change your practice? How are you going to change your clinical trials? And it is true that maybe we need to push the manufacturers. But something that you mentioned before, it was, what do the regulatory bodies need to change to enable the manufacturers to do some of these things? So what can payers change? What can regulatory bodies change to enable this change in the dynamics in how clinical trials are designed, in how drugs are approved currently? I think we got some interesting answers, you know, in terms of how they can, of course, adapt new payment models, and we've heard a lot today, and we are going to continue hearing about these. But there was one in particular that say that maybe rewarding in a similar way that we do to orphan drugs, to have some kind of elderly drug reward for manufacturers. Beyond this, is this something feasible? Is this something that will actually drive or encourage a stronger focus on the elderly? Or is there anything else we can do from the payer perspective, from the regulatory perspective, to enable manufacturers in this space?
We have a question here, please. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to answer your question before, Rafat, but before doing that, I can comment on what you said around the question that you're asking around payers. So I think one interesting element to think about is around, you know, what payers are ready to pay. I mean, we know today that, we focus a lot on efficacy, right? And we heard today, the whole day, payers mentioning, we don't want to pay for products that don't work. But actually, maybe for the elderly group of patients, there is not only efficacy, maybe there is more around also convenience or other KPIs that, although it's not common, maybe we can evolve into this direction that particularly for this group, we look at what's really important, right? And maybe living longer at any cost, right? Versus maybe convenience. That's what I think. Right. And Rafat, back to your question around this provocative question around, I think you asked, can wealthy cover their own costs, right? A wealthy retired.
And especially the last 30 years, the baby boomers and generation after that, their investment fund has done very well. And their house prices have gone very high as well. So they're sitting on the assets.
I think that is a fantastic question. There is a lot of discussion at the moment ongoing in Europe around, this discrepancy between poor and rich. I mean, we know it from developing countries, but we see it also. We start to see it more and more in Europe. And actually, the more wealthy population, older wealthy population in Europe, or some of them at least, start to be open to the concept of either paying more taxes to give away more, right? In order to close the gap between the poor and the rich. And I think, it's not about if they pay for their healthcare or if they pay higher taxes, but it's definitely a valid point, right? Otherwise, we kind of average the access to health for elderly, although a part of them can maybe afford much more, right? And they take away from the rest. I think it's a very important question.
No, thank you. We are coming very close to our timing. So go ahead.
No, just to add here, I think this is brilliant. I really like that. Just to add here, if you break the cost of healthcare by the groups of the spend, I'm still surprised that the cost of the drugs, actually, it used to be 17%, now it's going down to close to 16-15%. It's 1/6 of the total cost of healthcare. And in the same time, the cost of healthcare coming from the payer fees, from the, what we call in the US, middlemen, right? From PBMs, from payers, from the processing, from adjudication clearinghouses, from the EMR providers, from all those additional steps that are involved in the healthcare, now it's approaching to almost 50%, which I think is amazing.
But actually, this is a great bridge to one of the last questions. So I think you both talk about going beyond the pill. So yes, the drug has this cost, but what else do we need to think about? What can healthcare providers, manufacturers, regulatory bodies, governments can do to really optimize healthcare expenditure? Because I think we are reaching a point where maybe it's not going to be sustainable for so long. So what can we do? And I think one of the answers, and this is a very generic but very true answer, think holistically, as you just say. We need to think about the cost beyond the actual drug. In practical terms, is there anything that we can think about that could be easily implemented, whether it's immediately or slowly, but that we can start doing already to address this?
And you can start from the drug. Like we heard this morning that, for example, an auto-injector can be a much better option. Also for elderly, maybe they're not able to do on their own, but a carer giving you an injection rather than a carer having to drive you to a hospital to get the injection, it massively reduces cost because also the carers, especially for the elders, I'm speaking about my country, Italy, for example, we take care of our elderly quite a lot, but the cost for the carers is quite high, and there are so many lost days of work, for example, associated to it. So it's not just the healthcare, it's the whole economy of a country that you probably need to look at.
Now, thank you very much, everybody, and we will open the floor for further questions. Any other further questions from?
Sorry.
Very good. Yeah, if you have any further question, please come connect to our booth.
Thank you
very much.
everyone, and have a
Thank
good
you,
evening.
Igor. Thank you.